Emily's shift at Glacier National Park had already stretched long past the time her relief should have arrived. The summer storm sweeping over the Rockies was making everything harder. Soaked trails, broken branches, and frightened visitors who underestimated how quickly the weather could turn. Most rangers would have headed back to the main station once the lightning started to scatter across the ridgelines. But Emily never measured her work in shifts or clocked hours. For her, the rhythm of the park grizzlies moving through berry patches, elk bugling at dusk, osprey diving toward McDonald Creek was the only time that mattered. When the radio crackled with a call about a downed tree near a bear corridor, she knew she couldn't leave it for morning. Bears in this park had right-of-way, especially grizzlies, and blocked paths often spelled trouble. Grant, the supervising ranger, came through the channel with clipped words, "Leave it. Too dangerous in this weather." She acknowledged his order, but kept walking. Orders were one thing. A wild animal in pain was another. The rain turned the soil into slick clay under her boots. When she rounded a bend, she saw the tree lying across the trail, bark, stripped branches shattered. What stopped her cold wasn't the tree, but the sound, a low, desperate moan, unlike the warning growl of an adult bear. She dropped her flashlight beam lower. There, half buried beneath the broken limbs, lay a grizzly cub. Its paw twisted unnaturally, flank heaving, eyes wide with both fear and exhaustion. Emily's training told her to back away. A mother could be near, and even injured cubs were dangerous to approach. Yet everything in her chest pulled her forward. She scanned the trees, no adult bear. The storm had scattered scents, rain washing away tracks. The cub was alone. Her first step wasn't toward the animal, but toward the procedure. She crouched 10 feet away, watching its breathing. She spoke softly, not to tame it, but to keep herself steady. "Easy, little one. I just want to see." She checked the angle of the leg. Bone hadn't broken through the skin, but the joint was swelling. Painful, but not hopeless. She'd seen similar injuries with mountain goats, and even once with a black bear yearling hit by a vehicle. Emily unclipped her pack. Rescue micro-procedural scene begins here. She pulled out a coil of rope, her field knife, and a few strips of canvas she always carried. She cut 2 firm branches from the fallen tree, trimmed them smooth, and measured against the cub's leg with her eyes. The cub shuddered, but didn't lunge. Maybe too weak, maybe sensing her intent. She slid closer, her movements deliberate. With practiced hands, she wrapped the leg, gently splinting it between the 2 branches. Every turn of the rope was careful, not too tight to cut off blood flow, not too loose to slip away. She whispered steady words. "Almost done. Hold on." Now came the hardest choice: move it or leave it. Storms often drove predators down into the valleys. A defenseless cub here could become easy prey. Yet moving it risked worsening the injury. Emily weighed options, hands trembling not with fear but urgency. In her years on the job, she had learned that the line between action and inaction was often the line between life and death. She decided to drag part of the fallen tree to form a lean-to, sheltering the cub without moving it far. A patch of pine boughs gave insulation from the wet ground. She radioed in, "Injured cub located." "Splinted and sheltered." Grant's reply was instant and furious. "Leave it. That's final." She shut off the radio. By then, her uniform was plastered with mud and pine sap, her hair heavy with rain. Yet what she carried most was the cub's gaze. Wild animals rarely hold human eyes for long. It's not in their survival code. But this one did. She felt an unspoken recognition, something beyond instinct. That moment alone could have carried her through the storm. It should have ended there, an act of quiet defiance, a ranger doing what she believed was right. But the storm the cub and her decision had set into motion, something far larger. She stayed until the cub's breathing steadied into shallow sleep. Each rumble of thunder rattled the trees, but she kept her hand near the animal, not touching, just letting her presence be felt. When she finally stood, she felt a tearing weight inside. The park service wasn't kind to rule breakers. She knew the fallout would come. Sure enough, as she returned toward the station, Grant was waiting at the trailhead lantern, casting his figure against the dark. His face was tight-jaw, locked. "You disobeyed a direct order. That's insubordination." Emily's reply was calm, though her heart pounded. It was an injured grizzly cub. It needed help. His eyes flashed. "We're not a wildlife hospital. You endangered yourself, the park, and our liability." The words were cold, measured, as though written in a policy manual. But the way he spat them, soaked boots, splashing mud, made them sting more than any printed rulebook. She knew pleading wouldn't work. Grant's style of leadership thrived on obedience. So she accepted the verdict without flinching. Then, "Fire me," she said. His silence was confirmation enough. For 3 years, she had worn the uniform, walked these trails, answered tourists' nervous questions about bears, and taught school groups about respecting wild animals. And just like that, with one compassionate act, she was dismissed. She left the station carrying nothing more than her pack, wet and heavy, her badge tucked into the side pocket. Most people faced with such loss would have turned bitter, but Emily's heart was still anchored to the cub breathing under that pine shelter. She didn't regret her choice, not for 1 second. In wildlife work, there's a constant tension between protocol and compassion. Protocol keeps humans safe. Compassion keeps us human. Too often, agencies lean so hard on policy that they forget every policy is built on the foundation of a single truth: life matters. Emily's refusal to abandon the cub wasn't recklessness. It was a reminder that rules mean little if they erase the very heart that makes people care for wild animals in the first place. Think about it. How many times in everyday life do we step back fearing disapproval or reprisal and let small cruelties pass unchallenged? Maybe it's a neighbor shouting at their dog. Maybe it's someone cutting down a tree full of nesting birds. Emily's act on a stormy Montana night was simply the wilderness version of that moment. She chose not to look away, and while it cost her position, it preserved her integrity. Compassion may not always align with policy, but it is the only compass that points unfailingly toward what is right. For a brief example, consider the 2018 case in Colorado, where residents defied orders and protected a black bear cub that had been orphaned by hunters. Officials scolded them for interference, but when the cub was eventually rehabilitated and released, it thrived. That story was not about citizens versus government. It was about ordinary people remembering their responsibility to the creatures sharing their landscape. Emily stood in that same tradition. She walked into the storm that night stripped of title and uniform, but not stripped of purpose. What she didn't yet realize was that her action had not gone unnoticed. The cub under the pine wasn't the only one aware of her choice. Somewhere beyond the ridge in the dark sweep of rain and wind, others were listening, and by dawn, they would answer. That long night of exile was only the beginning. Emily thought she had lost everything by saving one grizzly cub, but when morning light touched the valley, she would discover she had gained something far greater, a connection that defied explanation. Emily left the station that night without ceremony. The rain had turned icy, stinging her face as she walked the gravel road away from the ranger's quarters. Her badge, surrendered hours earlier, felt like a weight she no longer carried. She was not just dismissed from her job, she was cut off from the only home she had built in years. But as heavy as the loss felt, her thoughts kept circling back to the grizzly cub. She needed shelter before hypothermia set in. The nearest backcountry outpost sat 2 miles north, a place rangers used when trails washed out or when tourists got lost in sudden snow. She kept her head low against the storm and walked, her boots sinking into slush. Each step sounded too loud in the dark, and the silence between thunderclaps carried a presence she could not shake. The cabin came into view, a shadow tucked against the trees. Its single room was bare except for a cot wood stove and a lantern missing its glass. She hung her soaked jacket by the stove and knelt to light tinder. Flames struggled, caught, then warmed the small space. She set her knife and rope within arm's reach, a habit she'd picked up on countless overnights in bear country. It should have been safe, but the night refused to settle. She felt watched. At first, she thought it was just nerves from losing everything in one evening, but then she heard movement outside, soft but deliberate. Not wind, not deer. The scrape of claws on wet ground. Her instincts sharpened. She reached for the knife. Then through the walls of rain came a sound she could not mistake the huffing exhale of a bear. She froze. A grizzly near the outpost was no surprise. This was their territory. What chilled her was that the sound didn't move away. It stayed. Another exhale joined it, then another. Emily lifted the shuttered lantern and peered through the warped window. Nothing. Just sheets of rain. Yet the hair on her arms lifted. She had spent years studying wild animals. She knew when she was being tested, observed. Her chest tightened as she remembered the cub's eyes wide with pain but steady, fixed on her as she bound its leg. Could animals carry such moments into memory? Science said their instincts were sharper than ours, their communication rich with scent, posture, and tone. But memory of human kindness that belonged in stories, not field reports. She forced herself to sit back on the cot. Sleep came in restless fragments broken by sounds of movement in the brush. She woke fully when a growl, low vibrating, rolled across the clearing. Instead of fear, she felt a strange calm, as though the sound was not warning her, but anchoring her. By dawn, the rain had slowed to drizzle. She stepped outside into a landscape washed clean. That was when she saw the first shape. A bear, heavy-shouldered fur dripping, standing 20 yards away. Then another. Then more. One by one they emerged from the tree line until she counted 10. Her pulse quickened as the truth sank in. They weren't dispersing. They were forming a circle. Unsure whether to retreat, she started along the trail toward the ridge. The ground ahead had collapsed in the storm, leaving a narrow arroyo swollen with runoff. Crossing alone was risky, the kind of decision that ended rescues badly. She tested the mud and nearly slipped. Before she could reconsider, a bear stepped to the edge, placing its weight firmly, showing the solid ground. She stared. Coincidence or guidance she chose to trust. Step by step, she made it across the animals, watching, but not interfering. Minutes later, another hazard appeared, the sharp yips of coyotes closing in. She turned, knife in hand, ready for a desperate defense. But the bears shifted. Several moved forward, boxing her in the center, their sheer presence pushing the predators back into the brush. Coyotes knew when the odds were not in their favor. They melted away. Emily lowered the knife, stunned. This wasn't random. These grizzlies were acting with intention. She recalled scientific studies on wolves forming protective flanks around injured packmates. She had never read anything comparable about bears. Yet here, they were creating patterns of defense that mimicked the very corridor behavior she had seen in elk during migration. She began to notice signals, the way they circled. Before halting, the way low rumbles from one were answered by another, and the way they held formation until she moved again. She realized 3 things. Choral calls meant cohesion, circling meant protection, and corridor forming meant direction. But there was a limit. Each time her hand brushed the knife hilt, the formation faltered. Weapons broke the unity. That was the cost. She walked for over an hour, the bears pacing around her. Every step felt surreal. How could she, a dismissed ranger, have become the center of this procession? What drew them here? Was it the cub? Or something older? Something the human mind was slow to accept. For clarity, it helps to consider an example from history. In Alaska several decades ago, there was a documented case where multiple bears were seen following a single sow who had survived a brutal winter. Rangers speculated that her survival tactics carried a kind of social weight. The idea that grizzlies could learn from each other's behavior wasn't accepted at the time, but later, studies confirmed that bear populations adapt by observing peers. If they can transmit survival strategies, could they also transmit recognition of human choices? Emily's act of rescue might have spread in ways no radio tower could trace. She paused near a cluster of aspens, exhaustion hitting her legs. The bears stopped too, spacing themselves in a wide arc. Not threatening, not waiting to strike. Waiting for her. That realization landed heavy. She was no longer just a witness to wildlife rescue. She was part of something the wild itself had chosen to create. Sometimes exile strips away everything we thought defined us, only to reveal the role we were meant to play. Emily's badge was gone, her authority revoked. Yet standing in a circle of 20 grizzly bears, she held more influence than she ever had inside park headquarters. From a fresh perspective, this was not about one woman or one cub. It was about the fragile contract between humans and wild animals. Too often people treat wilderness as property, something to be managed, fenced, or exploited. But these bears were reminding her, and by extension all of us, that wild animals do not operate on our rules. They respond to signals deeper than law, and sometimes those signals recognize compassion as power. Emily adjusted her pack and started walking again. The circle moved with her, silent, steady, deliberate. She had been fired for saving one life, yet now she was being escorted by many. Mystery hung in every step. She did not know where they were taking her. She did not know why they had come. She only knew that the exile she feared had become a passage, and the signals in the night were guiding her towards something larger than herself. When the valley opened before her, and she saw the park headquarters in the distance, the truth struck with force. The grizzlies were not leading her away from people. They were leading her back. By morning, the exile would become a return, and the entire park would witness what no one could explain. Emily reached the ridge as the sky broke into pale silver. Below, stretched the valley floor, washed clean by the storm. She should have been alone. Instead, she stood in the middle of a living tide. 20 grizzly bears moved around her, steady as shadows, their paws sinking into wet soil, their breaths rising like mist. They weren't driving her out of their territory, they were guiding her back in. The path wound downward, slick from rain. Emily tested each step. Behind her, the cub she had splintered the night before limped along, but stronger than she thought possible. When it stumbled, an older bear paused beside it, lowering its head in what looked like patience. That image alone could have undone her. The same animals she had been trained to warn visitors about, now showing a kind of guardianship she had never studied in manuals. It wasn't a random movement. The bears positioned themselves with uncanny order. 2 took the lead, setting the pace. Others flanked her, a loose corridor that closed whenever she slowed. At intervals, they circled a pattern she had started to recognize: protection, cohesion, communication. She was part of their formation, whether she wanted to be or not. Emily tried to veer left toward a side canyon. Immediately, the corridor shifted, nudging her back to the main descent. She laughed quietly despite the fear prickling her skin. "You're not giving me a choice, are you?" Her voice was swallowed by the air, but one of the bears lifted its head as if acknowledging. In wildlife biology, such precision would be dismissed as projection, humans attaching meaning to animal behavior. But here, meaning felt undeniable. The bears weren't dispersing into forage patterns, not breaking into solitary movement as grizzlies usually did at dawn. They were acting with a unity closer to elk herds during migration or wolves on the hunt. And yet there was no prey, no seasonal urgency. The only constant in their formation was her. Foreshadow beat from earlier now pays off. She thought back to the cub under the fallen tree, the way its eyes had locked with hers. Had that single act of compassion rippled through the unseen networks of these wild animals? Scientists had written about elephants carrying stories of waterholes across generations, or dolphins teaching hunting tricks across pods. But grizzly bears had always been cast as solitary. This procession was rewriting that assumption step by step. An hour into the descent, the ground leveled into a meadow. Mist clung to the grass. The sun finally pierced the clouds, washing the clearing with amber light. That was when Emily saw something she couldn't ignore: more bears emerging from tree lines to join the formation. A sow with 2 yearlings came from the east. A heavy boar padded down from the ridgeline. Within minutes, the number doubled. She stopped counting at 25. Her mind wrestled with 2 truths at once. First, this was impossible by every textbook definition. Second, it was happening, and the lesson was clear in her chest, even if not yet in her words. The natural world does not need our permission to surprise us. To ground herself, she remembered a case study from Yellowstone. In 2007, a group of bears was observed feeding in uncharacteristic proximity, something previously thought unlikely for the species. At the time, it was dismissed as a coincidence around a rich food source. But some biologists later argued it hinted at a social flexibility not yet understood. What Emily was walking in now was that same principle magnified not for food, but for purpose. Her boots sank deeper into the mud as the procession neared the valley floor. Each footfall of the animals sent vibrations through the ground, steady like drums. The sound unnerved her at first, but soon it became a rhythm she walked in time with, as though she had been drafted into a march older than human memory. The bears adjusted their pace when she slowed. They resumed only when she lifted her head. For the first time since being fired, Emily felt not banished, but chosen. The strange paradox struck her. Stripped of authority by humans, she had been given authority of another kind, by the wild. And here lies a perspective worth carrying forward. When we lose roles society assigns us, we often mistake it for losing our worth. Yet the earth holds different measures. Emily's badge was gone, but her compassion had become currency in a system no policy controlled. They passed through the meadow without incident, but the message was unmistakable. This was not an accidental gathering of wild animals. It was deliberate choreography, and though Emily could not explain it, she sensed its cost. Every time her thoughts flickered to fear, the corridor wavered. Every time she steadied her breath, the line reformed. Unity required calm. Panic fractured it. By mid-morning, the valley opened fully, revealing the scattered buildings of the park headquarters. The flag by the visitor center sagged damp and heavy. From this distance, it should have been a welcome sight, but Emily's stomach tightened. What would her former colleagues see if she approached flanked by dozens of grizzly bears? They would see threat, not testament. They would see danger, not a miracle. And yet the procession did not break. More bears continued to arrive, some lumbering from creek beds, others stepping from timber stands. The line swelled, not unruly, but intentional, as though a tide was converging on one point. By the time Emily reached the first fence line, she knew hundreds of eyes would soon be on her. Compassion is not a quiet act. Sometimes it echoes so loudly that the world cannot help but turn its gaze. Her single choice to bind a cub's leg had grown into a movement she could not command or contain. The wild had taken her action and translated it into its own language: formation, protection, return. As they neared the perimeter, she saw figures at the station. Park staff frozen in place. Binoculars, raised hands pointing. She could not hear words, but she knew what they were saying. Impossible, dangerous, unbelievable. A woman who had been fired the night before was walking back, escorted by a procession of grizzly bears. People often assume wild animals act only out of survival instinct. Food territory. Mating, but what if survival itself includes recognizing loyalty, reciprocity, even the faint threads of gratitude? Maybe these categories we label human are not ours alone. Maybe loyalty runs through the veins of wild animals too, only waiting for us to notice. Emily's pulse quickened as the first bear placed its paw on the gravel of the main road leading to the station. The others followed, still in formation. She realized the path they were creating was narrowing into a corridor that pointed directly toward the visitor center. They weren't dispersing across the property. They were leading her, and she had no choice but to walk it. By the time Emily reached the gate, the silence of the staff was drowned out by a new sound, the rising clamor of shouts, engines, and alarms. The procession had returned her not to peace, but to a park on the edge of crisis. What awaited her at headquarters would test not only her courage, but the very bond she had discovered in the March of the Bears. By the time Emily stepped onto the gravel road leading to headquarters, the sound of the bears' paws was drowned out by shouting. Rangers ran across the yard, radios crackling. Tourists clustered by their vehicles, cameras half raised, fear written on every face. The unexpected procession of grizzly bears had turned the park into chaos. The animals didn't scatter. They slowed, forming deliberate lines that stopped just short of the main fence. Their stillness was more unsettling than a charge. It was an order where everyone expected disorder. Emily could feel the air tighten as colleagues tried to interpret what they were seeing. Grant appeared on the steps of the visitor center, his voice harsh over the commotion. "Get them back. Arm the tranquilizers." His words carried the force of authority, but not conviction. The sight of 20 bears standing shoulder to shoulder broke the usual chain of command. Emily stepped forward, raising her hands. "Don't shoot! They're not here to attack." Her voice cracked, but she forced calm into every syllable. The corridor of animals widened just enough for her to pass. She walked until she stood between the bears and the staff, the symbol of the impossible. A tense silence followed. Even the tourists lowered their voices. Everyone was waiting for the first mistake. Ranch control room moment adapted for the park begins here. Sheriff Lucas arrived on horseback, dust rising from the trail behind him. He dismounted quickly and strode toward Emily. "Explain this," he demanded, though his tone held more awe than anger. She took a breath. "They followed me here. They've been protecting me since last night." She pointed toward the cub limping at the edge of the formation. "I splinted that cub's leg. The others, they know." Grant scoffed. "Superstition. They're wild animals. They don't understand loyalty." Lucas turned to Emily. "What do you suggest? I've got civilians panicking, rangers with weapons, and bears refusing to move." Emily forced herself to think like the ranger she no longer was. "First, stop yelling. Noise escalates fear. Second, we create a calm lane, an opening where people can move safely out of sight. Third, we keep weapons down. Fear breaks their formation. Calm keeps it." It wasn't a plea. It was a procedure spoken with conviction. For years, she had studied black bear encounters with campers and knew that escalation often came from human panic, not animal intent. She shared an example quickly. In 2015 at Yosemite, a group of hikers panicked when a bear entered their camp. They shouted through rocks and chaos broke out. But another group nearby stayed calm, spoke softly, and the same bear passed through without incident. Same animal, different outcome. We need to be the second group. The sheriff nodded slowly. His men began guiding tourists through a side gate, creating a narrow lane shielded by parked vehicles. The shouts dimmed to whispers, weapons lowered. The storm of panic subsided just enough for order to take hold. Emily turned back to the formation. The bears hadn't moved. They were waiting. And that was when she realized something deeper. This wasn't about forcing the animals out. It was about proving whether humans could handle the moment without violence. The bears weren't the ones in crisis. The people were. That was the small lesson beating in Emily's chest. What we label as a crisis often says more about us than about the situation itself. The bears weren't threatening to charge. They were simply present in ways humans didn't understand. The crisis came from human minds trying to fit mystery into categories of danger. As the lane cleared the park, Superintendent finally appeared. His suit was damp, his hair still combed from a morning meeting he'd abandoned. He looked at Emily with both fury and unease. "You've caused a disaster," he said. "Visitors terrified, property at risk. You're not even employed here anymore." Emily met his gaze. "I didn't bring them, they came. You can fire me, but you can't fire them. And right now, every decision you make will show whether this park stands for profit or for respect." The superintendent glanced at Lucas, then at the silent crowd of tourists, some of whom were quietly filming. Reputation was at stake as much as safety. He exhaled through his nose and gave a reluctant nod. "Do what you think will work. But if this turns dangerous, it's on you." That reluctant permission shifted the balance. Emily and Lucas gathered the rangers into a circle. "No sudden movements," she said. "No raised voices. Spread out. Keep space between you and let them see your hands. We're not corralling them. We're giving them options." It was, in essence, a crisis drill, but one rooted in trust rather than control. And slowly the energy changed. Bears began to move, not in a charge, but in deliberate lines that resembled migration paths. Some walked the fence perimeter. Others paced the lane Emily had envisioned. They weren't scattering randomly. They were drawing patterns that suggested direction. Emily's heart hammered, yet she recognized the echo of behaviors she'd studied in elk and bison herds. What she was witnessing with grizzly bears had never been documented. People often imagine wild animals as agents of chaos, threatening the order of human life. Yet sometimes it is our insistence on control that creates chaos. These bears were showing more coordination than the humans who thought they needed to contain them. The crisis, in other words, was an invitation to let go of dominance and embrace coexistence. An older ranger muttered near her, "Never thought I'd see the day I'd take orders from bears." Emily allowed herself the faintest smile. Maybe it's not orders. Maybe it's guidance. The cub limped forward, drawing the eye of every onlooker. It moved steadily, no longer collapsing with each step. When it reached Emily, it paused, then turned back toward the bears. That single act, walking to her, then facing them, felt like a signal. She could feel it in her bones. The cub was declaring itself alive, healed, and not abandoned. The formation shifted again, opening a broader corridor straight toward the stable at the edge of the yard. It was as if the procession itself demanded that humans witness what compassion could accomplish. Emily took a step and the corridor widened. She glanced back at Lucas. He nodded. Go. So she walked, flanked by rangers, on one side, grizzlies on the other, heading toward the building where the cub's shelter had been improvised the night before. Every tourist fell silent. Cameras lowered. Even Grant had nothing to say. And that moment crystallized into the lesson she would carry forever. Real leadership isn't about control. It's about calming fear long enough for trust to surface. When she reached the stable doors, Emily placed her hand on the wood. Inside, she could hear movement, and she knew the next chapter was about to unfold. The crisis of the morning had revealed one truth: the bears were not here to destroy. They were here to bear witness. But when the doors opened and the cub stepped into the light, what followed would test the line between science and miracle. The stable smelled of wet wood and smoke. Emily pushed the door with her shoulder heart tight, unsure of what she would find. The cub she had splintered the night before lay inside, a head raised, eyes alert. The makeshift bandage was still wrapped around its leg. But when it stood, the room fell silent. The injury that should have left it crippled was no longer dictating its steps. The cub placed weight on the paw, steady and sure. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Grant's jaw slackened. A ranger whispered, "That's impossible." Emily didn't answer. She stepped closer, eyes locked on the animal she had once thought might not survive the night. She touched the splint gently, then unwrapped it with trembling hands. Beneath the leg was swollen only faintly scar tissue, forming in ways that looked weeks old, not hours. The cub took a step forward, then another crossed the room toward the open air. It moved with surprising grace, no limp visible. The bears outside shifted, parting to make space. It was as though they had been waiting for this moment. The park's contract vet, who had arrived during the morning's chaos, pushed through the crowd. He crouched, palpating the leg, checking the range of motion and testing weight-bearing. His face turned pale. "This doesn't make sense. Tissue repair doesn't work like this. Not in grizzly bears, not in any animal." He pulled out a portable scanner, pressed it to the cub's leg, and frowned at the reading. "The inflammation is practically gone. That's weeks of healing overnight." Murmurs spread. Phones lifted again, recording. Science and mystery clashed in the same space, neither yielding ground. Emily stood rooted, her chest full of conflicting emotions: relief, awe, and a strange humility. She had done what she could, splinted, sheltered, comforted, but something larger had taken over the rest. Whether it was biology, resilience, or something that refused to be named, she couldn't tell. What mattered was that the cub lived. And here's the explanation worth pausing on. In wildlife medicine, recovery is never instantaneous. Even black bear cubs known for resilience take weeks to regain mobility after fractures. Tissue regenerates with time, nutrition, and rest. Yet occasionally, outliers emerge, cases that defy charts. In 2013, researchers in Alaska documented a polar bear that survived deep lacerations from a fight, closing wounds within days, faster than predicted. Biology called it remarkable. Communities nearby called it a blessing. Both were true in their own way. Emily knew this wasn't the first time people had argued over miracle versus science. But she also knew the argument missed the point. What she saw in front of her was not about proof. It was about possibility. Compassion plants seeds that sometimes grow into outcomes we cannot explain. You don't splint a leg expecting a miracle. You splint a leg because life deserves a chance. What happens after is not yours to command. The cub walked directly to Emily, pressing its muzzle briefly against her arm before turning back toward the line of bears. The gesture was small, but everyone felt it. It was an acknowledgement, gratitude perhaps, or recognition that a bond existed across the barrier that people assumed divided species. Humans often imagine themselves as saviors of wild animals, but what if the relationship is less about saving and more about partnership? Emily hadn't forced healing. She had simply offered care. The bears had responded in ways beyond her reach. Maybe the real miracle wasn't the cub's leg, it was the shared recognition that life matters enough to fight for. Grant finally broke the silence, his voice brittle. This is theater. Some freak healing response. Nothing more. But his words fell flat. The cub standing whole before him was argument enough. Emily thought of her mentor, the ranger who had once taught her how to care for an injured eagle after a storm. He had said, "Sometimes the wild answers kindness with a swiftness we can't measure. Don't try to own it. Just witness it." That memory settled deep in her chest now. She turned to Lucas. "They brought me back here to show this. To show that choosing compassion doesn't go unnoticed." The sheriff didn't argue. His hand rested on his holster, not out of fear, but out of habit. Yet his eyes softened. Maybe we're the ones being taught today. Wild animals are not blank slates onto which humans project values. They are agents of their own lives, capable of responses that challenge our categories. Call it instinct, call it a miracle, the labels don't matter. The outcome does. The crowd of visitors had shifted from fear to reverence. Some wiped tears, others stood with hands clasped as though at a ceremony. The cub, once written off as doomed, now moved freely among its kin. The herd of bears accepted it back into formation without hesitation. Emily breathed deeply. For the first time since being fired, she felt no anger toward Grant or the superintendent. What happened here had outstripped their authority. This wasn't about employment or rules. It was about a reminder that nature still held mysteries capable of humbling every chart, every directive, every certainty. Science and mystery are not enemies. They are companions asking us to hold curiosity in one hand and reverence in the other. If we lose either, we miss the fullness of what wild animals can teach us. The cub lifted its head and gave a sharp cry, a sound that was neither distress nor aggression. Immediately, the other bears responded with low rumbles, a chorus that seemed to weave the cub back into their collective. It was music made of breath and earth, something no instrument could replicate. Emily swallowed hard. She could not explain it. She did not need to. What mattered was that a young life had been restored, and in that restoration, an entire community of humans and animals had been called to witness. As the chorus faded, heavy hoofbeats sounded from the main road. Dust lifted in the distance, and Emily recognized the figures of ranchers and officials riding hard toward the park. The miracle of the cub had barely settled, yet conflict was galloping closer. What came next would not be awe, but confrontation. The cub had barely rejoined its kin when a new sound broke the fragile calm, hoofbeats on gravel, the metallic clatter of tack, the bark of men calling to each other. Dust rolled over the horizon, and with it came riders Sheriff Lucas at the front, flanked by ranchers whose faces were set with anger. Behind them trailed trucks carrying deputies' headlights glaring even in daylight. The procession of grizzly bears shifted. They didn't scatter, but they did react, forming a tighter arc around Emily. Their bodies became a wall, massive and unmoving. The visitors at the park fell silent, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. The sheriff reined in hard, his horse sidestepping nervously at the sight of so many bears. He dismounted quickly, boots sinking into mud. He raised a hand. "Morrison's stock is missing. Henderson's too. Reports say dozens of animals are gone from ranches across the valley. And here I find you." His eyes landed on Emily, then on the bears. in the middle of all this. The ranchers behind him shouted, voices overlapping. "Those grizzlies are dangerous." Our cattle were scattered, fences trampled. "This is theft, plain and simple." Grant seized the moment, stepping forward with renewed confidence. "You see, she brought this on us, fired last night, and now she's returned with an army of wild animals." "If that's not sabotage, what is?" Emily stood still, letting the shouts burn themselves down. She didn't argue over the volume. Instead, she raised her hand in the same calm gesture she had used with the panicked tourists earlier. They weren't stolen. They came. Her words were quiet, but carried. The sheriff frowned. "Animals don't just march themselves across miles of valley, across property lines, through storms. Somebody led them." Emily shook her head. "I couldn't lead them if I tried. They've been guiding me, not the other way around." The men muttered, disbelief heavy. The superintendent, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Sheriff, this is a park matter. We'll handle it internally." His voice trembled, but he was trying to cling to control. Lucas ignored him. "I've got 17 reports of missing stock. This isn't just a park issue, it's a county issue. And if these bears threaten people, it becomes a state issue." The tension thickened. The rangers kept their hands near their weapons, though none dared raise them. The bear's corridor remained intact, steady as stone. Emily took a step forward, her boots leaving prints in the wet gravel. "Then let's do what we do if these were cattle mixed across ranch lines. We talk, we listen, we figure out where they belong and what happens next." She looked directly at the ranchers. "Each of you say what you've lost, what you fear, and what you want." It was bold, maybe foolish, but the sheriff gave a slight nod. The men began to speak one at a time. Henderson claimed his prize steer was missing. Another rancher complained about fences being trampled. A third admitted he had lost nothing yet, but feared he would. The voices grew less frantic once given room. Emily listened, then answered carefully. "Wild animals aren't property in the way livestock are. But I hear your fears. What if we create a transparent program? Any animal that stays here will be monitored, documented, and its impact on your lands recorded. If there are damages, they'll be addressed. If animals return to your ranges, they do so freely." The sheriff rubbed his chin. "Sounds like arbitration." "You're suggesting treating this like a dispute over stray cattle?" "Yes," Emily said firmly, "but with recognition that grizzly bears aren't cattle. They choose where they stay. We can only respect that choice." It was a radical suggestion. Some scoffed, yet others fell silent, caught between anger and the sight of the cub now standing healed strong, a living counter-argument to doubt. Emily pressed on. "There's precedent. In Montana, livestock disputes are resolved by brand inspections, shared costs, and agreements. Why not build a wildlife rescue model, the same way documentation care reports, restitution where necessary? You don't lose your rights, but you gain clarity, and the animals gain respect." The superintendent sputtered. "This is fantasy. Parks don't run on feelings. They run on rules and budgets." Emily met his eyes. "Then maybe the rules need rewriting. You can count profits and losses, but you can't count loyalty. And loyalty is what kept that cub alive." That word, loyalty, hung in the air. The ranchers shifted uneasily. They had lived close to wild animals all their lives, and though they often spoke of danger, they also knew moments of unexpected grace. A herd of elk sheltering cattle during a blizzard, or wolves ignoring stock when deer were plentiful. Loyalty wasn't so foreign after all. Crises often push us into corners where we cling to control. But sometimes the stronger choice is to open the circle to treat even adversaries, human or animal, as partners in negotiation. In Wyoming, when wolves were reintroduced, ranchers feared ruin. Some resisted, some fought, but others tried a new approach. Compensation programs, non-lethal deterrence, shared monitoring. It wasn't perfect, but it turned enemies into reluctant collaborators. This moment can be the same. The sheriff considered her words. His horse shifted nervously behind him, but he stayed grounded. "I don't know if I believe what I'm seeing," he admitted. "But I know this shooting won't solve it. If 17 ranchers fire, we'll have blood in the dirt and nothing resolved." Grant's face reddened. "You can't let her rewrite the laws. She's twisting this to her advantage." But even his anger was losing ground. The cub limped forward, no longer weak, and pressed itself lightly against Emily's leg before returning to the herd. That single gesture silenced more than any argument could. Authority is often assumed to rest in badges, titles, and weapons. Yet in that moment, authority rested in the presence of one healed cub and the silent unity of the bears. Power wasn't commanded, it was recognized. Emily spoke softly, but the words carried to everyone present. "You can call this theft, you can call it superstition, or you can call it what it is, a reminder that wild animals don't belong to us, they belong to themselves. Our choice is whether we meet them with fear or with respect." The sheriff nodded slowly. "We'll try it your way. But know this, Emily, you'll be accountable for whatever happens next." "I accept that," she said simply. The ranchers murmured among themselves, divided but less combative. The superintendent looked like a man watching the ground shift under his feet. Grant stood, rigid fists clenched, unwilling to yield, but unable to act. And that is the lesson this confrontation pressed upon everyone. True authority doesn't come from control. It comes from earning enough trust that even your critics pause to listen. Yet not everyone was willing to pause. As the crowd began to thin, one voice rose sharp and furious. "Grant!" His hand moved to his weapon. His eyes locked on the cub. In that instant, Emily knew the fragile peace was about to shatter, and the next choice would determine whether loyalty survived or was drowned in fear. The council of voices was ending when Grant snapped. His face burned red, his voice shaking with fury. "Enough talk. These are wild animals. Nothing more. I'll prove it." His hand went to his holster. The crowd froze. The cub was standing near Emily, its chest still heaving from its miraculous return. Grant raised the gun. The sheriff barked, "Don't!" But the foreman's eyes were locked on the small bear, desperate to reclaim authority through violence. The bears reacted instantly. The corridor they had held all morning collapsed, inward bodies tightening into a wall of fur and muscle around Emily. Low rumbles shook the air, not chaotic, but synchronized. It was the sound of a warning older than language. Emily's pulse pounded. She stepped in front of the cub, palms raised. "Grant, look at me. If you fire, you don't just shoot an animal. You shatter the last thread of trust holding this together." He hesitated, sweat streaking down his temple. The silence stretched. Dozens of eyes, human and animal, were fixed on him. The bears did not lunge, but their gaze was heavy as stone. And then something happened that no one expected. The cub stepped forward past Emily and faced Grant directly. Its small frame didn't waver. Its eyes held his. In that stillness, the message was unmistakable: defiance without aggression, courage without violence. The sheriff spoke again, softer this time. "Grant, stand down. You're not proving strength, you're showing fear." Grant's hands shook. His finger tightened, then loosened. The gun wavered, then lowered. He looked around for support, but the ranchers who had once shouted with him now stared at the ground. Authority had left him. He holstered the weapon, face twisted in defeat. The superintendent cleared his throat, trying to salvage control. "This doesn't change the fact that park policy." But his words were drowned out by the sound of the bears shifting again. Not in anger this time, but in unity. They began to move, circling Emily and the cub. Their steps beat a rhythm on the earth, steady, deliberate. The corridor reformed, but this time it wasn't for protection, it was for recognition. She was no longer simply the woman who had been fired. She was the center of their formation, their chosen. The onlookers whispered. Some removed their hats. Others simply stared, caught in awe. Emily felt tears blur her vision. She hadn't sought this role. All she had done was refuse to abandon one life, And yet that single choice had transformed her into something she never imagined, a bridge between two worlds. Among the circle, a younger cub mimicked the healed one stepping into the corridor, lifting its head, echoing the same gesture of defiance and loyalty. Emily caught the detail and understood. This language was spreading a way of being passed through generations. For clarity. Let's step back. In animal behavior studies, mimicry often precedes learning. Young elephants copy the matriarch's rumble calls before they know their meaning. Young wolves shadow adults in hunts long before they understand strategy. What Emily saw in that cub was the same principle: imitation as inheritance. Compassion had not only healed one, it was teaching others how to stand. The sheriff broke the silence. "Grant, you're relieved. Effective immediately. You've endangered lives." His tone left no room for argument. The superintendent didn't protest this time. He had seen authority passed to someone else entirely, and he knew clinging to titles would only expose his weakness further. True leadership isn't about dominance or threats. It's about earning enough trust that others choose to stand with you. Emily hadn't commanded the bears. She had simply lived in a way that invited their recognition. An example from history helps illuminate this. In 1916, naturalist Charles Sheldon wrote of a grizzly he had tracked in Denali for months. The bear tolerated his presence, never aggressive, never fleeing. Sheldon concluded that coexistence was possible not because he had mastered the animal, but because he had respected its space. Respect, not control, was the silent agreement. Emily was standing in the same tradition, only amplified into something the whole valley could witness. Humans spend so much time trying to define the boundary between ourselves and wild animals. But what if the boundary isn't fixed? What if loyalty, courage, and recognition flow both ways? The bears weren't submitting to Emily, and she wasn't mastering them. They were acknowledging each other as partners in survival. Grant staggered back, shoulders slumped, authority drained. For years he had measured worth in obedience, in making others yield. Now he was the one exposed, undone by a cub's silent defiance and a woman's quiet compassion. His downfall wasn't through violence, but through irrelevance. Emily placed her hand gently on the healed cub's shoulder. Its fur was warm, its heartbeat steady. She whispered, "You're safe now." The circle of bears widened, giving her space to breathe. Around her, people seemed to exhale all at once. This was the transformation the morning had been building toward. Not just the humbling of a foreman or the revelation of a miracle, but the rewriting of what loyalty meant in the relationship between humans and wild animals. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't fear. It was a choice. Emily turned to the sheriff and the superintendent. "The bears have shown what trust looks like. It's our turn to decide if we'll match it." No one argued. The silence was answer enough. As the day waned, the bears began to settle in the meadows around headquarters, neither leaving nor threatening. The cub rested near Emily's feet, the others forming a loose perimeter. It was clear they had not come, only for a moment they had come to stay. And as the sun sank behind the Rockies, Emily understood the true test was not the standoff. The true test would be what humans chose to build from this fragile new beginning. Evening fell over Glacier National Park with a stillness no one expected. The storm had passed, but what lingered was more powerful than rain or thunder. The grizzly bears had not scattered. They remained near the meadows, some grazing quietly, others resting in slow rhythms of breath. The cub Emily had splinted curled at her feet, alive, whole, and unafraid. The sheriff dismissed his men. The ranchers rode off slower than they had arrived, their anger softened into silence they couldn't explain. The superintendent, once ready to push Emily out for good, stood at the edge of the yard, staring at the animals as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted. Grant had already gone stripped of the authority he clung to. The transformation was complete. Emily remained. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't sought power, hadn't demanded recognition. She had simply refused to abandon a life when ordered to turn away. That was the heartbeat of it all. Compassion had been the small act that cracked the door, and loyalty had rushed in to fill the space. The superintendent approached at last, his voice low. You've seen something I can't deny. The park needs you. Will you take the lead on all of them?" He gestured to the meadow. Emily hesitated, her eyes on the bears forming quiet patterns in the grass. She knew the truth. They didn't belong to her. They didn't belong to anyone. But humans had a choice to harm or to respect, to dominate or to partner. She nodded slowly. "Yes, but on one condition. They're not property. They're partners. Any program must begin with that truth." The superintendent said nothing more. He knew he wasn't negotiating from power. Authority had shifted, and he was wise enough to recognize it. Quarantine pens for monitoring, regular vet checks, and transparent reports for the public. Not to cage the bears, but to reassure people that coexistence could be managed responsibly. She explained compensation programs used in wolf reintroductions, deterrents that prevented conflict, and observation windows that allowed humans and wild animals to share space safely. Knowledge turned fear into action, and action turned into hope. Visitors lingered, recording, whispering. They weren't just watching animals. They were watching the rewriting of what it meant to live beside them. True change doesn't begin with grand strategies. It begins with one act of compassion strong enough to ripple outward. Emily hadn't planned a movement. She had simply saved a cub. And yet that act became a language, one the bears carried across valleys, one the people now had to learn. For perspective, look at how conservation has always advanced. In the 1960s, black bears were nearly eradicated in parts of the US because of fear. But when communities chose to protect instead of persecute, populations rebounded. It wasn't numbers alone that changed, it was perception. People began to see not monsters, but wild animals capable of resilience. Grizzly bears now face similar crossroads, classified as endangered animals in many regions. The choice humans make will determine whether they vanish or thrive. Emily understood this now with sharper clarity. Knowledge matters, biology, law, history. But knowledge alone doesn't inspire transformation. Emotions do. It's the sight of a cub standing on healed legs. It's the sound of bears moving in formation without threat. It's the mystery that refuses to be explained away. These are the sparks that ignite real change. Humans often imagine themselves as guardians of wild animals, but perhaps the reverse is also true. Perhaps wild animals remind us of qualities we lose in pursuit of order and control. Loyalty, patience, courage to stand without violence. The bears were not Emily's followers. They were teachers. As the sun slipped behind the Rockies, Emily stood at the threshold of her new life. She wasn't just rehired. She was reborn into a role she didn't even know existed, a bridge between people and wild animals, carrying forward a message carved not by speeches but by presence. The cub nuzzled her arm, then bounded into the meadow, welcomed by its kin. The corridor of bears opened not as protection this time, but as an invitation. Emily whispered to herself, "This is what loyalty looks like." And so the emotional payoff wasn't about her vindication or even her new position. It was about the redefinition of what loyalty, compassion, and leadership mean when humans dare to see wild animals not as resources, but as partners. The world would talk about the miracle. Some would analyze it, others dismiss it. But the people who stood there that day knew they had witnessed the possible future of coexistence. Ecosystems thrive when balance is respected. Remove wolves and deer overrun the valleys. Protect black bears and forests regenerate with healthier diversity. Every choice ripples outward, just as Emily's choice had rippled through the valley that night. And here's the lesson to hold close: we don't control loyalty. We earn it, and once earned, it can change everything. Before the night closed, Emily looked at the circle of rangers and townsfolk still gathered. She didn't tell them what to believe. She only said, "What you saw today was real. The question is, what will you do with it?" That's the same question I want to leave you with now. Because this story isn't just about grizzly bears or one woman in Montana. It's about all of us. How do we respond when compassion costs us something? Do we turn away? Or do we step forward, even if no one else does? Take a moment to reflect. Think about the spaces in your life where a single act of kindness might ripple further than you can imagine. Think about the wild animals, the people, the fragile connections waiting for someone to choose compassion first. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in loyalty and second chances in the mystery of the natural world, then join us. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Because the journey of compassion doesn't end here. It only begins with one step, one act, one choice, just as Emily chose to save a cub, and the bears chose to show her what loyalty truly means.